June 1941. German panzer commanders were about to learn the most brutal lesson of their careers, and by the time they realized their mistake, thousands of their comrades would be dead. The summer of 1941 began with absolute confidence for the German Wehrmacht. Operation Barbarossa was unfolding like a masterpiece. German panzer divisions carved through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter, racing hundreds of miles deep into enemy territory. Tank commanders felt invincible. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs had crushed everything Europe threw at them. Polish cavalry, French heavies, British armor, all destroyed with cold precision. The Wehrmacht believed they commanded the finest armored force the world had ever seen. Soviet tanks? Technological jokes. German intelligence dismissed them as obsolete garbage, flimsy BT-5s and T-26s with paper-thin armor and pathetic guns. Early weeks of Barbarossa confirmed everything. German anti-tank crews destroyed Soviet armor by the hundreds, racking up kills so easily it felt unsporting. Panzer veterans shared crude jokes about Soviet coffins on tracks that exploded at the first hit. Nazi ideology fueled this arrogance. How could inferior Slavs possibly challenge superior German engineering? Late June 1941, a single Soviet tank blocked a critical supply road. Not for hours, for 2 full days. One tank, holding off an entire German division. It destroyed vehicle after vehicle, while German soldiers watched their anti-tank rounds bounce off like pebbles. Shell after shell ricocheted harmlessly away. Veteran gunners, who had never missed, couldn't believe their eyes. When they finally knocked it out and approached the wreckage, German soldiers discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of the war: the T-34. Everything they thought they knew about Soviet engineering was a lie, and they were about to pay for that arrogance in blood. The T-34 represented a quantum leap in tank design that caught the Germans completely by surprise. While German intelligence knew the Soviets were developing new tanks, the actual capabilities of the T-34 exceeded even the most pessimistic German estimates. What made this tank so revolutionary was not a single feature, but rather an innovative combination of 3 critical elements: armor protection, firepower, and mobility. The armor scheme of the T-34 was unlike anything the Germans had encountered. Instead of the traditional vertical armor plates used on virtually all contemporary tanks, Soviet designers employed radical sloped armor across the entire hull and turret. The frontal armor was set at approximately 60 degrees from vertical, a design choice that seemed strange to German tank experts accustomed to maximizing armor thickness through perpendicular plates. The actual thickness of the T-34's frontal armor was only 45 millimeters, which on paper seemed modest compared to the 50-60 millimeter frontal armor on German Panzer IVs. However, the sloping created a revolutionary effect. When a projectile strikes sloped armor, it must travel through a much greater thickness of metal than the nominal plate thickness. The T-34's 45 millimeter armor, when sloped at 60 degrees, presented an effective thickness of approximately 90 millimeters to an incoming projectile traveling on a horizontal trajectory. This meant that the T-34's armor was nearly twice as thick as it appeared, effectively doubling its protection without adding additional weight. The sloping provided 2 additional defensive benefits that German gunners discovered to their frustration. First, projectiles striking sloped armor at acute angles had a significantly higher probability of ricocheting rather than penetrating. German anti-tank crews reported watching their armor-piercing rounds skip off T-34 hulls like stones on water, particularly when the shot struck at anything other than perfect perpendicular angles. Second, even when rounds managed to penetrate the sloped armor, the angled entry often caused the projectile to tumble and lose energy as it passed through the plate, reducing the damage inflicted on the interior. The gun mounted on the T-34 was equally impressive. The 76.2mm F-34 gun was significantly more powerful than anything mounted on contemporary German tanks. The standard German Panzer III carried a 50mm gun, while the Panzer IV mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun designed primarily for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. The T-34's F-34 gun could penetrate the frontal armor of every German tank in service in 1941 at ranges exceeding 500 meters. When firing armor-piercing composite rigid APCR ammunition, the F-34 could punch through 92 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and 60 millimeters at 1,000 meters. This meant the T-34 could destroy any German tank at distances where German guns could barely scratch its sloped armor. The third revolutionary aspect of the T-34 was its mobility. Powered by a robust V12 diesel engine producing 500 horsepower, the T-34 could reach speeds of 53 kilometers per hour on roads. More importantly, its wide tracks distributed the tank's weight over a larger surface area, giving it exceptional performance in mud, snow, and soft terrain that bogged down narrower-tracked German Panzers. The diesel engine itself offered advantages over the gasoline engines used in German tanks, including greater fuel efficiency, longer operational range, and reduced fire risk. The appearance of the T-34 on Eastern Front battlefields sent shockwaves through the German military hierarchy. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant Panzer leader who had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, personally inspected captured T-34s in November 1941 and was profoundly shaken by what he found. In his memoirs, Guderian wrote that the T-34 demonstrated vast superiority over contemporary German tanks. This wasn't hyperbole or defeatism. It was the sober assessment of Germany's foremost armored warfare expert, acknowledging that the Wehrmacht had been technologically outclassed. The initial German response to the T-34 ranged from disbelief to panic. Tank commanders who had confidently engaged Soviet armor for months suddenly found themselves outgunned and out-armored. One wartime German report described a 37mm anti-tank gun crew firing 23 rounds directly at a single T-34, achieving multiple hits on the hull and turret, yet only managing to jam the tank's turret ring without penetrating the armor. The standard German 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank gun, nicknamed the Door Knocker by German troops for its ineffectiveness, was completely useless against T-34 frontal armor beyond point-blank range. Even the improved 50mm Pak-38 anti-tank gun, rushed to the Eastern Front specifically to counter heavier Soviet tanks, struggled against the T-34. A German report from May 1942 noted that combating the T-34 with the 50mm gun is possible only at short ranges from the flank or rear, where it is important to achieve a hit as perpendicular to the surface as possible. This meant German anti-tank crews had to maneuver to the sides or rear of T-34s and engage at close range, extremely dangerous tactics that often resulted in the destruction of the German guns before they could score killing hits. German tank crews faced an equally desperate situation. The Panzer III, the backbone of German armored divisions in 1941, mounted a 50mm gun that could barely scratch T-34 frontal armor at combat ranges. Only at distances under 100 meters, at near perpendicular angles to the T-34's sloped plates, did the Panzer III's gun have any chance of penetration. Meanwhile, the T-34's 76 2mm gun could destroy a Panzer III from 500 meters or more, creating a lethal engagement range where German tanks were helpless victims. The Panzer IV fared little better initially. While its 75mm gun had good high-explosive performance against infantry and fortifications, the short-barreled version lacked the velocity to penetrate T-34 armor at useful ranges. German tank crews found themselves in the nightmarish position of scoring direct hits on T-34s and watching their rounds bounce harmlessly off the sloped armor. Soviet tank crews, by contrast, could engage German panzers with confidence, knowing their armor would deflect most incoming fire, while their guns could devastate enemy tanks. Faced with a tank that could not be defeated frontally in fair combat, German forces developed desperate tactical countermeasures. German doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, and this flexibility allowed panzer divisions to partially mitigate the T-34 threat through tactical ingenuity rather than technological parity. The most effective German response involved the 88mm flak gun. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but pressed into anti-tank service. The 88's high-velocity shells could penetrate T-34 armor at long ranges, and German commanders began deploying these valuable guns in anti-tank roles whenever possible. However, 88mm guns were relatively scarce, needed for air defense, and extremely difficult to move and camouflage compared to smaller anti-tank weapons. German forces also relied heavily on ambush tactics, attempting to engage T-34s from the flanks or rear, where the armor was thinner and less dramatically sloped. Panzer crews were instructed to avoid frontal engagements entirely and to use superior German optics and tactical coordination to maneuver into favorable firing positions. These tactics required enormous discipline and skill, as Soviet numerical superiority meant German tanks were often outnumbered and surrounded. Artillery and infantry became critical anti-tank assets. German forces deployed towed anti-tank guns in carefully camouflaged positions, hoping to ambush T-34s at close range, where even lighter guns might achieve flank penetrations. Infantry squads were trained to attack Soviet tanks with magnetic mines, Molotov cocktails, and specialized anti-tank grenades. Extremely dangerous work that resulted in heavy casualties. The Luftwaffe was frequently called upon to destroy T-34s with dive bombers and ground attack aircraft, but this required air superiority and favorable weather conditions. These tactical adaptations allowed German forces to continue destroying T-34s despite their technological inferiority, but at enormous cost in time, ammunition, and casualties. Every engagement became a complex tactical problem, requiring careful planning and coordination, while Soviet tank crews could often simply drive forward and shoot, confident in their armor protection. The appearance of the T-34 forced a fundamental reassessment of German tank development and production priorities. In November 1941, a German commission inspected, captured T-34s, and recommended that Germany immediately cease production of existing tank designs and simply copy the T-34. This radical proposal was ultimately rejected, partly due to the practical difficulties of retooling German factories for Soviet designs, and partly due to ideological resistance to the idea that inferior Soviet engineering could surpass German technology. Instead, Germany embarked on crash programs to develop tanks capable of matching the T-34. The immediate response was to upgun existing designs. The Panzer IV received a long-barreled 75mm L-43 gun in early 1942, designated the Panzer IV F2. This weapon could finally penetrate T-34 frontal armor at combat ranges up to 1,000 meters, restoring some parity to tank versus tank combat. Later variants mounted an even longer L-48 gun with improved penetration. The Panzer IV upgrade was merely a stopgap. Germany initiated development of entirely new medium and heavy tanks designed specifically to counter the T-34. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, borrowed heavily from the T-34's design philosophy, incorporating sloped armor, a powerful high-velocity gun, and emphasis on mobility. The Tiger heavy tank, armed with the formidable 88mm gun and protected by massive armor, was also accelerated into production. These new German tanks were technologically sophisticated and individually superior to the T-34 in many respects, but they came with crippling drawbacks. The Panther and Tiger were mechanically complex, difficult to manufacture, expensive to produce, and plagued by reliability problems. German industry struggled to manufacture these advanced designs in adequate numbers, while Soviet factories churned out T-34s by the tens of thousands. The T-34 forced Germany into a production crisis. Retooling factories, training workers on new designs, and manufacturing more complex tanks dramatically reduced German tank production at a critical moment in the war. Meanwhile, Soviet production of T-34s accelerated throughout the war, creating an insurmountable numerical imbalance. By 1943, Germany was producing sophisticated but scarce tanks, while the Soviet Union was mass-producing reliable and effective T-34s in overwhelming quantities. The T-34's greatest strength was not merely its combat capabilities, but its brilliant design for mass production. Soviet engineers created a tank that could be manufactured quickly by semi-skilled workers using available materials and relatively simple tools. This design philosophy contrasted sharply with German emphasis on precision engineering and manufacturing complexity. The T-34's hull was constructed from large welded plates rather than complex assemblies of smaller pieces, reducing manufacturing time and labor requirements. The sloped armor design, beyond its protective benefits, actually simplified construction by using large flat plates that were easier to fabricate than the complex curves and joints required for vertical armor. The diesel engine was derived from an aluminum aircraft engine design, allowing production to leverage existing industrial infrastructure. Soviet industry proved remarkably adaptable under wartime pressure. When German forces threatened tank factories in Western Russia, entire production facilities were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers and their families made the journey together, and within months factories were producing T-34s in remote locations far from the fighting. Production quality varied considerably, with some tanks suffering from poor welding, inconsistent armor quality, and mechanical defects. However, Soviet doctrine prioritized quantity over perfection, reasoning that adequate tanks available immediately were more valuable than perfect tanks delivered too late. The production numbers tell the story. The Soviet Union manufactured over 84,000 T-34 tanks in various versions between 1940 and 1945, making it the most produced tank of World War II. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 8,500 Panther tanks and 1,350 Tigers during the same period. This massive disparity in production meant that even when German tanks achieved local tactical superiority, strategic victory was impossible. The T-34 was not a static design. Soviet engineers continuously improved the tank throughout the war, addressing weaknesses, while maintaining the advantages that made it revolutionary. The most significant upgrade came in 1944 with the introduction of the T-34-85, mounting a larger 85mm gun in a new three-man turret. This version improved firepower and crew ergonomics while retaining the fundamental design elements that made the original T-34 effective. Despite its revolutionary armor and firepower, the T-34 had significant weaknesses that German forces exploited whenever possible. The original two-man turret created severe crew coordination problems, with the commander forced to serve as gunner, loader, and tactician simultaneously. German tanks typically had three-man turrets with dedicated commanders, giving them superior situational awareness and tactical coordination. Soviet optics and vision devices were notably inferior to German equivalents, limiting the T-34's ability to engage targets at long range despite its powerful gun. German tank commanders often spotted and identified targets well before Soviet crews, allowing them to achieve first-shot advantages despite inferior armor and armament. Radio communications were another critical weakness. Early T-34s lacked radios entirely, with only command tanks equipped with communication systems. This severely hampered tactical coordination compared to German forces where every tank had radio equipment. The armor, while revolutionary in its sloping design, suffered from metallurgical inconsistencies. American tests of captured T-34s revealed significant variations in armor quality, with some plates using different steel alloys and heat treatments that affected protective performance. The extreme hardness that helped deflect armor-piercing rounds also made the armor brittle, causing spalling when struck by high-explosive shells. German gunners learned that even when they couldn't penetrate T-34 armor, high-explosive rounds could create dangerous metal fragments inside the crew compartment. Combat effectiveness depended not just on technical specifications, but on crew training and tactical doctrine. German tank crews in 1941 were veterans of multiple campaigns, highly trained professionals who understood combined arms tactics and battlefield coordination. Soviet tank crews, by contrast, varied wildly in quality. Some were experienced professionals, but many were hastily trained conscripts thrown into battle with minimal preparation. This training disparity helps explain the seemingly contradictory combat statistics. Despite the T-34's technical superiority, Soviet tank losses in 1941 were catastrophic, with the Red Army losing more than 7 tanks for every German tank destroyed. Superior German tactics, training, and coordination overcame the T-34's technological advantages in many engagements. German forces used combined arms tactics, radio coordination, and superior optics to ambush Soviet armor, score first hits, and withdraw before Soviet numerical superiority could overwhelm them. As the war progressed, Soviet tactical proficiency improved dramatically. Tank crews gained experience, training programs improved, and Soviet commanders developed doctrines that leveraged the T-34's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. By 1943-1944, the combination of improved crew training, overwhelming numerical superiority, and the inherent advantages of the T-34 design created an unstoppable offensive force. German testimony provides the most compelling evidence of the T-34's impact. A German officer's diary entry from 1944 captured the transformation. The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Leipzig. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft. But what terrifies me more than the bombers are the tanks. T-34s everywhere. Our new Panthers are magnificent when they work, but for every Panther we field, the Russians send 20 T-34s. It is mathematics, not courage, that will decide this war. German General Friedrich von Mellenthin, writing after the war, described the T-34 as the best tank of World War II, despite Germany's late-war technical innovations. This assessment came from a man who had commanded panzer divisions on multiple fronts and understood tank warfare as well as anyone alive. The T-34 earned this respect not through individual technical perfection, but through the devastating effectiveness of its overall design philosophy. The story of the T-34 and the desperate German response reveals fundamental truths about military technology, industrial warfare, and the fatal cost of arrogance. This wasn't just about one tank design beating another. It was about two completely different philosophies of war colliding on the bloodiest battlefield in human history. The T-34 succeeded, not because it was perfect, but because it was brutally effective, endlessly producible, and available in numbers that made German commanders physically sick. Soviet designers grasped a principle that German engineers, for all their technical brilliance, catastrophically missed. A good tank you can build 10,000 of will always defeat a perfect tank you can only build 1,000 of. German engineering represented the pinnacle of precision and sophistication. Every component machined to exacting tolerances, every system optimized for maximum performance. But none of that mattered when Soviet factories were churning out T-34s faster than German gunners could destroy them. This was arithmetic that couldn't be argued with, mathematics written in steel and blood. The sloped armor concept pioneered by the T-34 didn't just win a war. It revolutionized tank design for every nation on Earth. Before the T-34, most tanks used vertical armor plates because they were simpler to manufacture and easier to design around. The Soviets proved that sloped armor could nearly double effective protection without adding weight, a discovery so profound it instantly made every other tank design obsolete. After 1945, when the smoke finally cleared and military engineers worldwide studied what had actually worked on the battlefield, virtually every new tank incorporated sloped armor principles. The T-34's influence became universal and permanent. Look at any modern main battle tank. The American M1 Abrams with its distinctive angular hull, the British Challenger with its sloped glacis plate, the German Leopard 2, even Russia's own modern T-90. Every single one traces its design DNA directly back to concepts proven in combat by the T-34. That low profile, those angled plates deflecting incoming fire, the balance between protection and mobility, these became the foundational principles of armored warfare that persist to this day. For the German soldiers who initially mocked Soviet military technology, the T-34 delivered the most brutal education imaginable. Underestimate your enemy and die screaming. The confident German tankers of June 1941, who shared jokes about Soviet scrap metal on tracks and expected to be home by Christmas, learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the approaching T-34. That strange, sloped profile they initially dismissed as awkward Soviet design became the shape of their nightmares. Those angled plates that seemed primitive to German eyes proved devastatingly effective in actual combat. turning their best armor-piercing shells to dust and harmless fragments while protecting Soviet crews inside. Meanwhile, German panzers with their vertical armor burst into flames from hits that T-34s would simply shrug off. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German tank crews went from absolute confidence to genuine terror in the span of months. Veterans who had rolled through Poland and France with casual superiority now felt vulnerable every time they heard the distinctive roar of a T-34's engine. The T-34 stands as an eternal monument to innovative engineering and industrial might, triumphing over traditional military thinking and cultural prejudice. It wasn't the perfect tank, far from it. The cramped interior made crew efficiency suffer. The lack of a commander's cupola meant Soviet tank commanders had to fight partially exposed. Early models had terrible transmissions that failed constantly. But none of that mattered, because it was exactly the right tank for its time, purpose, and the nation that built it. In the crucible of the Eastern Front, where industrial capacity and logistical endurance mattered as much as tactical brilliance, the T-34's combination of protection, firepower, mobility, and mass producibility made it a genuine war-winning weapon. German soldiers learned too late, often in the last seconds of their lives, that mockery and racial prejudice were catastrophically poor substitutes for effective military hardware and sound strategic planning. The T-34 didn't just win battles, it changed warfare forever, and it made believers out of every soldier who faced it and lived to tell the tale.